I never believed in the supernatural. Ghosts, demons, and haunted woods were all part of the same nonsense as far as I was concerned. But my experience one fateful autumn evening changed my perspective forever. This is my story, as real as the chills that still haunt me to this day. I grew up in a small town nestled in the Pacific Northwest, surrounded by thick forests and towering pines. The woods were our playground, a place where my friends and I would build forts, climb trees, and explore until the sun dipped below the horizon. But there was one part of the forest we never ventured into, a place we called the Dark Path. The Dark Path was an old, overgrown trail that led deep into the heart of the forest. Legends told of strange occurrences and disappearances linked to that area, but we dismissed them as mere campfire tales meant to scare children. My skepticism was put to the test one chilly evening when I decided to prove there was nothing to fear. It was a crisp October afternoon when I set out. The leaves were a tapestry of red, orange, and yellow, crunching underfoot as I made my way to the edge of the woods. My friend Jake had dared me to spend the night at the old hunter's cabin, rumored to be hidden along the dark path. Armed with a flashlight, a sleeping bag, and a sense of bravado, I accepted the challenge. The entrance to the dark path was almost hidden by dense underbrush, but I found it easily enough. As I stepped onto the trail, a sense of unease settled over me. The trees seemed to close in, blocking out the remaining sunlight, and the forest grew eerily silent. I brushed off the feeling and pressed on. After about an hour of walking, I found the cabin. It was a dilapidated structure, barely standing, with moss-covered shingles and a door hanging on a single hinge. The air was thick with the scent of decay and damp wood. I set up my sleeping bag inside and tried to make myself comfortable, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. As night fell, the forest around me came alive with strange sounds. Twigs snapped, leaves rustled, and distant, unidentifiable noises echoed through the trees. I told myself it was just wildlife, but deep down I knew something was off. I decided to explore the area a bit, hoping to dispel my growing fear. With my flashlight in hand, I ventured outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. I walked around the cabin, peering into the forest, when suddenly I heard it. A faint, whispering voice. It was so soft I almost thought I imagined it. I froze, straining to hear. "Help! Me!" The voice was distant, barely audible but unmistakably human. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the forest, looking for the source. The whisper came again, a little louder this time, leading me further into the woods. Against my better judgment, I followed. The whispers grew louder and more urgent as I walked, guiding me deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to twist and turn in unnatural ways, creating a maze-like path that I could barely navigate. Panic began to set in as I realized I was hopelessly lost. The whispers became more frantic, almost desperate. "Help! Me! Please!" I stopped in my tracks, my flashlight flickering. The voice sounded so close, yet I saw nothing. The temperature dropped suddenly and a chill ran down my spine. I turned around, ready to head back to the cabin when I saw them. Two glowing eyes staring at me from the darkness. They were not the eyes of any animal I had ever seen. They were large, yellow, and seemed to pierce right through me. Paralyzed with fear, I could do nothing but stare back. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow all sound. Then, the creature stepped into the light. It was humanoid, but twisted and deformed, with elongated limbs and pale, translucent skin. Its mouth was a gaping maw of darkness, and it moved with an unnatural, jerky motion. The eyes never left mine as it crept closer, and I felt a cold, clammy hand grip my heart. My instincts kicked in, and I turned to run. The forest was a blur as I sprinted through the trees, the creature's footsteps pounding behind me. I stumbled and fell, my flashlight skittering away into the darkness. Desperation took over as I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline fueling my escape. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually the footsteps faded, and I found myself back at the cabin. I slammed the door shut and barricaded it with whatever I could find. My breathing was ragged, and sweat poured down my face. I huddled in the corner, flashlight clutched in my shaking hands, waiting for dawn. The night seemed to stretch on forever, every creak and groan of the old cabin sending waves of terror through me. The whispers never returned, but the memory of those eyes haunted me. When the first light of morning filtered through the cracks in the walls, I finally dared to move. I gathered my things and bolted out of the cabin, not stopping until I was back in the safety of my own home. I told Jake and my friends what happened, but they laughed it off as a prank gone wrong. No one believed me, and I couldn't blame them. It sounded too unbelievable, too nightmarish to be real. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know that the dark path holds secrets that are better left undisturbed. I've never set foot in those woods again, and I warn anyone who will listen to stay away. Some places are meant to be feared, and the dark path is one of them. The forest still stands, silent and foreboding, a reminder of the terror that lurks within. And every October, as the leaves turn and the nights grow long, I remember that night and the creature that stalked me. It's a fear that never fades, a horror that's all too real. I've always loved hiking. Growing up in the rural outskirts of Maine, the dense forests surrounding my home were my playground. My friends and I would spend entire days exploring the thick woods, imagining we were intrepid explorers charting unknown territory. But it wasn't until the summer of 2018 that I experienced something that would change my perception of those woods forever. It was an encounter so deeply unsettling that it still haunts me to this day. It was a particularly hot and humid July afternoon when I decided to venture deeper into the woods than I ever had before. I had just finished college and was back home for the summer, feeling nostalgic and eager for some solitude in nature. I packed my backpack with the essentials: water, snacks, a flashlight, and my trusty old map of the area. My mother, always the worrywart, made me promise to be back before dark. I assured her I would, and set off with a sense of excitement and adventure. The first few hours of my hike were peaceful and uneventful. I followed a well-worn trail that eventually gave way to narrower, less trodden paths. As I ventured further, the familiar sights and sounds of the forest grew more distant, replaced by an eerie silence that was both unnerving and strangely captivating. I felt like I was stepping into another world, one untouched by human presence. Around mid-afternoon, I stumbled upon an old, overgrown trail that wasn't marked on my map. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow it. The path wound deeper into the forest, becoming increasingly narrow and difficult to navigate. The trees grew taller and denser, their branches forming a thick canopy overhead that blocked out much of the sunlight. The air grew cooler, and an unsettling feeling began to creep over me. After what felt like hours, I came across a clearing. In the center stood the remnants of an old, dilapidated cabin. It looked like it hadn't been inhabited in decades, maybe even longer. The wooden walls were rotting and covered in moss, and the roof had partially caved in. Despite its condition, there was something about the cabin that drew me in. I felt an inexplicable urge to explore it. As I approached the cabin, I noticed strange symbols carved into the door and surrounding trees. They were unlike anything I had ever seen before, intricate and almost otherworldly. A chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off as my imagination running wild. I pushed the door open, and it creaked loudly, echoing through the silent forest. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty. The only light came from the broken windows, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The floor was littered with debris, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. As I explored further, I found old, rusted tools and broken furniture, but nothing that explained the strange symbols outside. Then I found the journal. It was lying on a small, rickety table, covered in dust. The leather cover was worn and cracked, and the pages were yellowed with age. I picked it up and carefully opened it, my heart pounding with anticipation. The handwriting was shaky and difficult to read, but as I began to decipher the words, a sense of dread washed over me. The journal belonged to a man named Samuel, who had lived in the cabin many years ago. His entries spoke of strange occurrences in the forest, of eerie sounds and unexplained sightings. He wrote about feeling watched, about finding the same symbols I had seen, and about the growing sense of fear that consumed him. The final entry was the most disturbing of all. They come at night. I hear them whispering outside, scratching at the walls. I've barricaded myself inside, but I don't think it will hold. If anyone finds this journal, leave this place. Do not stay after dark. They will find you. A sense of panic set in as I realized the sun was beginning to set. I had lost track of time while reading the journal, and the forest was growing darker by the minute. I grabbed my flashlight and hurriedly made my way back to the trail. The once peaceful forest now felt menacing. The shadows longer and darker, the silence oppressive. As I retraced my steps, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. I quickened my pace, desperate to put as much distance between myself and the cabin as possible. But no matter how fast I walked, the feeling of being followed persisted. Then I heard it. A low, guttural whisper. It seemed to come from all around me, echoing through the trees. I spun around, shining my flashlight in every direction, but there was no one there. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and I could make out words, though they were in a language I didn't understand. Fear turned to terror as I broke into a run. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees forming an impenetrable wall. The whispers were now accompanied by a scratching sound, like claws on bark, and I could feel eyes on me, watching, waiting. I ran blindly through the woods, not caring about the path, just wanting to escape. After what felt like an eternity, I burst through the tree line and into the open field near my house. The whispers stopped abruptly, and the oppressive feeling lifted. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked back at the forest, now dark and foreboding, and vowed never to venture that deep again. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in those woods. I never told anyone about the cabin or the journal, fearing they would think I was crazy. But I know what I experienced was real. The symbols, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. They were all too vivid to be a mere figment of my imagination. Now, whenever I hike, I stick to the familiar trails and always make sure I'm back before dark. The forest may be beautiful and serene, but I know that lurking in its depths are secrets best left undiscovered. The invitation arrived on a crisp autumn morning, nestled innocuously among bills and flyers on my kitchen table. It was a handwritten note from my childhood friend, Eric, inviting me to join him on a weekend camping trip in Blackwood Forest. Just like old times, the note read, one last adventure before the winter sets in. I hadn't seen Eric in years, and the idea of reconnecting appealed to me. Blackwood Forest was notorious for its dense woods and eerie silence, but it held a certain nostalgia for us. As kids, we'd spent countless summers exploring its winding trails and hidden clearings. The thought of revisiting those memories filled me with a mix of excitement and apprehension. We set off early Saturday morning, the sun just beginning to rise over the horizon. The drive to Blackwood Forest took a couple of hours, during which we caught up on each other's lives. Eric seemed the same, always enthusiastic and full of stories. He mentioned that he'd found a new, secluded spot in the forest that he'd been dying to show me. As we neared the forest, the roads became narrower and the trees loomed larger. The air grew cooler, and an unsettling stillness settled around us. We parked at the edge of the forest and grabbed our gear. Eric led the way, and I followed, the memories of our childhood adventures flooding back. After hiking for about an hour, we reached the clearing Eric had spoken of. It was a small, serene spot, surrounded by towering trees. A stream trickled nearby, its gentle gurgling the only sound breaking the silence. We set up our tent and gathered wood for a fire. As the sun dipped below the tree line, casting long shadows across the forest floor, we settled in for the night. Over the crackling fire, we reminisced about our childhood escapades, laughing at the foolish things we'd done. But as the night wore on, an uneasy feeling crept over me. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, the usual nocturnal sounds absent. Eric, however, seemed unfazed, attributing the silence to the onset of winter. Sometime around midnight, I was jolted awake by a noise outside the tent. It was a soft rustling, like someone, or something, moving through the underbrush. I lay still, straining to listen, but the sound had stopped. I glanced over at Eric, who was sound asleep. I told myself it was just an animal and tried to go back to sleep, but a sense of unease lingered. Just as I was drifting off again, I heard it. A faint whisper, almost inaudible but unmistakably human. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, frozen with fear. The whispering continued for what felt like an eternity, before fading into silence. The next morning, I awoke feeling groggy and unsettled. Eric seemed oblivious to my distress, cheerfully suggesting we explore a nearby cave he'd found on a previous trip. I hesitated, but didn't want to dampen his spirits. We packed some supplies and set off, the memory of the whispers haunting me. The cave was about a mile from our campsite, hidden behind a dense thicket. It was dark and foreboding, but curiosity got the better of me. We lit our flashlights and ventured inside. The air was damp and musty, and the walls were covered in strange, ancient carvings. As we delved deeper, the cave opened into a larger chamber. In the center of the room was a stone altar, covered in what looked like dried blood. My stomach churned, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. Eric approached the altar, seemingly fascinated, while I hung back, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees casting sinister shadows in the firelight. Eric was uncharacteristically quiet, his earlier enthusiasm replaced by a distant look in his eyes. As we sat by the fire, I noticed something glinting in the darkness just beyond the edge of the clearing. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it towards the object. It was a small, rusted locket, half buried in the dirt. I picked it up and opened it, revealing a faded photograph of a young girl. Eric's face went pale when he saw the locket. He muttered something about it being a mistake and abruptly stood up, heading towards the tent. I followed, demanding an explanation. He finally confessed that he'd found the locket on his last trip and had been hearing whispers ever since. He believed the forest was haunted and that we had disturbed something malevolent. That night was the worst. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. Shadows danced around our tent, and the air grew thick with a sense of impending doom. Eric and I huddled together, terrified and powerless. The whispers seemed to be all around us, closing in. In the early hours of the morning, I heard a voice, clear and distinct, calling my name. It was coming from the direction of the cave. Despite my fear, I felt compelled to follow it. I grabbed my flashlight and stumbled through the forest, the voice guiding me. When I reached the cave, the voice stopped. I shone my flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness. There, standing by the altar, was the figure of a young girl. Her eyes were hollow, and her mouth moved in a silent plea. I was paralyzed with fear, but something in her expression urged me forward. As I approached, she pointed to the locket in my hand. I placed it on the altar, and a sudden gust of wind blew through the cave, extinguishing my flashlight. In the pitch darkness, I felt a presence surround me, whispering in my ear. It was a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, their words incomprehensible, but filled with anguish. Just as I felt I couldn't bear it any longer, the voices stopped, and the cave fell silent. I stumbled out into the pre-dawn light, my mind reeling. Eric was waiting for me at the campsite, his face ashen and eyes wide with fear. Without a word, we packed up and left, the forest seeming to watch us as we fled. We never spoke of that night again. Eric moved away shortly after, and we lost touch. I returned to my normal life, but the memories of that weekend haunted me. I often wondered what we had disturbed in Blackwood Forest, and whether it was still there, waiting for its next unsuspecting visitors. Years later, I came across an old newspaper article about a series of mysterious disappearances in Blackwood Forest dating back decades. The article mentioned a local legend about a young girl who had vanished under strange circumstances, her locket the only clue ever found. I still have that locket, hidden away in a drawer, a grim reminder of the horrors we encountered. Sometimes on quiet nights, I can still hear the whispers, faint and distant, calling me back to the forest. But I know I'll never return. Some secrets are best left buried, and some places are best left undisturbed.